So thanks everyone for coming. Today we're going to talk about defence. So I'm Robin McAlpine, I'm Director of Commonweal, and I'm chairing today on behalf of the Scottish Independence Convention. And if we just start from left to right, if everyone in the panel would just like to introduce themselves. John?
John Ainslie, Coordinator of Scottish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and quite a long time in the past I used to be in the Army.
John MacDonald, I'm Director of the Scottish Global Forum. The views expressed here are those of my own. I do not necessarily represent those of the Scottish Global Forum.
I'm Norrie McQueen, I'm fellow Scottish Global Forum and also fellow University of St Andrews, and I certainly don't represent University of St Andrews, I'm going to say. My interest is in peacekeeping and United Nations, basically.
Isabel Lindsay, Vice Chair of Scottish CND and a campaigner on this issue since 1960.
Ivan McKee, businessman and Director of Business for Scotland.
Okay, that's great. What we'll start off with then is what we're launching today is a Commonweal paper, the Defence and Foreign Policy of an Independent Scotland. So what we'll do is we'll invite John to speak to the key findings of that for 5 or 10 minutes. But I think what we'd probably like to draw particular attention to is the extent to which we could save £1 billion and, for the first time, have Scotland's borders actually defended. So what we are really pointing out here is that Scotland's waters, we have no threat from foreign invasion, but we do have piracy and people trafficking, a whole range of other things that we should be monitoring in our waters, and we don't do it because the UK's entire defence budget is all directed towards overseas power projection and not actually defending our borders. So the capacity for us to do more positively international, be better defended and spend less seems like a win-win-win. John?
Thank you. Thinking then about how an independent Scotland would construct its defence, how it would engage with the world. One of the leading narratives within the debate, I think really, from people on one side of the debate in particular, has been about diminution, about an impotence, about a lack of global clout, about an inability to engage with the international community as the UK does. And in some ways, those criticisms kind of miss the point, because obviously for many people who support independence, this is entirely the point, that the way the UK dedicates itself to defending the nation, the way the UK dedicates itself to actually engaging in the world, is something which maybe some people want to move away from. And actually kind of thinking about this idea that an independent Scotland would be a diminished military actor, that it would be different, well, I would say yes, it would be. But this needn't necessarily be viewed in a negative way. There's no doubt that a yes vote would allow Scotland to press reset in how it engages with the world. I'm going to run over some of the brief issues here, particularly actually looking at expenditure and actually what we do with defence, because a lot of the discussion about defence and foreign policy has rested upon money, upon finances, about expenditure, and considerably less time, unfortunately, has been dedicated to considering what we would actually do by way of defending the Scottish people and the physical environment, which I think is maybe kind of neglected under the current UK model. So, on the issue of money, let's start with that. I think there is no doubt whatsoever that under independence, Scotland would be able to vastly reduce its military spending. The tax contribution that Scottish citizens make to the UK defence model each year is quite staggering. In recent years it's been as high as £3.3 billion annually. That's considerably more than countries such as Denmark and Finland spend on their defence. So for a start, even if we take the current Scottish Government's projected £2.5 billion spend, which is just one model of course, that's not set in stone, even under that model would still be saving a considerable amount of money each year in terms of expenditure, the demand made on Scottish taxpayers. But there's other things to consider as well. We can assume, I think, fairly reasonably that if Scotland were to be independent, Scottish taxpayers wouldn't be asked to contribute to big ticket items such as the UK nuclear force, perhaps £130 billion expended upon that over the course of the next generation. And even big ticket items such as aircraft carriers, which cost around about £3 billion each. And having a defence budget which isn't being pooled by big ticket items such as that, I think there is every capacity that a Scottish military force we would be better equipped, and that Scotland's defence budget would extend to areas such as, for example, paying conditions for soldiers' military housing, which under a beaten and battered UK military budget gets scant attention. So firstly, I think it's important to point out that there is a massive capacity to reduce demand on Scottish taxpayers through defence and foreign policy. Would that result in a diminution of security and defence? Well, I think it's possible to argue very, very strongly no. And one key issue which we find when we examine the issues is that, as Robin alluded to earlier on, one thing which seems to characterise the UK defence model, or defence/foreign policy model, is that in actually having this emphasis on global outreach, being able to sail aircraft carriers into foreign ports, and placing an emphasis on this, there's a finite budget, and it invariably results in areas and foci which need to be cut. And one particular area which has been cut and under-attended to, it seems to me, is domestic defence. Arguably the most fundamental reason why we have a defence force in the first place. And looking at the various issues, we think that greater attention should be paid to the home front in a number of different issues. We know, looking at statistics in recent years, that smuggling of various contraband goods is up. These don't really contribute to criminal activity and to money being spent on things such as weapons procurement. They also result in massive losses to the Exchequer. I think in 2012, the UK government itself estimated that in smuggled tobacco products alone, between £2 and £2.5 billion was lost to the Exchequer. If you look at it in hard financial terms, that's an annual defence budget in itself. And I think Home Secretaries have actually admitted that one of the reasons why these issues are under-attended to is because of cuts to the Customs Service. We see things like people trafficking, sex trafficking on the rise in recent years. We're aware of the trafficking issues that made the news yesterday. And again, many people have talked to a worrying underinvestment in customs division and actually contributing towards these things. Other issues as well, ecological issues, maritime security and defence, under-attended to as well. Sweeping cuts to Coast Guard provision, with all the attendant risks attached to shipping safety, environmental disaster, all that kind of stuff as well. The risk to maritime environment particularly pronounced perhaps when we consider the implications of the opening up of the Northern Sea route and the massive increase in shipping traffic that we're going to see coming down from the north of Scotland in the years to come. So what we recommend, if we were trying to kind of sculpt a more appropriate defence model for Scotland, would be this emphasis on the home front, a security model which is focused first and foremost upon securing Scotland's land, sea and people, trying to address first and foremost these fundamental human security issues, people trafficking, environmental protection and the protection of environmental resources. These really are, I think, the two key issues that I want to touch upon first and foremost. Great capacity to save money and the greater capacity to actually prioritise the most fundamental element of defence, protecting the home front. But as I think my colleague Norrie McQueen will point out, that still leaves tremendous capacity for Scotland to act meaningfully in the international community.
So Scotland could use its defence budget to protect and help vulnerable women who are involved in, who've been captured by people trafficking, or we could use it to travel abroad and bomb vulnerable people. I think that's a fairly stark choice about what Scotland could do in terms of its defence future. But Norrie's got particular interest in the role that Scotland could take in international peacekeeping and positive overseas actions and interventions. Norrie?
Okay, well, just to carry on from John's statement, we've got a defence policy, a strategic defence policy which saves money, which is fit for purpose, which allows us to do what most national defence policies are primarily concerned with, and that's protect the national territory, the integrity of the territory. What else can we do, and what else can we do better? Well, one thing that Scotland has been constrained in, as being part of the United Kingdom, is making a proper contribution, and its full potential contribution to international peace and security, both politically and militarily. But we're thinking particularly in terms of the military contribution today, the strategic contribution. there is, in fact, a particular strength in peacekeeping which comes from relative weakness. It's the great paradox of peacekeeping. One of the things that's constrained Britain as a peacekeeper is the amount of historical imperial baggage that it carries. It couldn't peacekeep during the Cold War because of its identification with one particular side. Even since the end of the Cold War, there's this notion of Britain as a country that's never really come to terms with its post-colonial identity and still does things along the kind of colonial track, has also constrained its possibilities in making a contribution. Now, an independent Scotland obviously is not constrained that way. Its relative weakness in terms of the toys for the boys, the equipment and the rest, suddenly becomes a strength, because the strength of the peacekeeping state, the peacekeeping contributor, lies in its acceptability within the international system, its acceptability to those who are engaged in conflict and who are looking for an intermediary. And a large part of that acceptability is being free from historical baggage I was talking about, but also not having the capacity to actually threaten the situation, having enough capacity to make a difference, to intervene, to peacekeep, but not to the extent where you're going to shape events on the ground. And you've got a core, effectively, of peacekeepers who demonstrate these characteristics. The most obvious model, as far as Scotland is concerned, I think, is Ireland, which, punching, to use the old cliche, punching enormously above its weight, and has done for the past 4 or 5 decades in terms of peacekeeping. But also Norway, also the Netherlands. In or out of NATO, it doesn't actually matter that much because it's a question of international perceptions of what your politics are about. But this isn't a purely altruistic thing. This is also something that is potentially very positive for a Scotland making its way in the international system from the beginning. Because it's to do with projection of soft power. It's to do with saying something about Scotland. And if you go back to the example of Ireland, Ireland managed, certainly in the 1960s and into the 1970s, to define its national foreign policy in terms of peacekeeping, in terms of contribution made to the United Nations, allowed Ireland to get rid of all the old baggage of partition and the Anglo-Irish relationship at the centre of its foreign policy. And Scotland certainly doesn't want that in its first phase of nationhood, a kind of dark obsession with the relationship that has just ended with England. So benefits accrue to the peacekeeper as well as to the peace kept in this relationship. And it would strike me that an independent Scotland, configured largely in the basis set out in the white paper, argue about that in details, but configured in terms of numbers and in terms of resources, as set out in the white paper last year, would be in a unique position to join this sort of elite core of international peacekeepers. And of course, there's a point at which the military contribution to peacekeeping begins to kind of bleed into a political contribution as well. Because you've got countries like Norway, countries like Ireland to some extent as well, but Norway is probably a better example, where the military contribution creates a particular impression, a particular image of a country in the world, which opens up all sorts of possibilities for it to make a political contribution as well, in terms of mediation and in terms of the act of fostering of peace and security in conflict situations, not just at the level of boots on the ground, but also in terms of mediation, brokerage, and the rest of it. And this would strike me as an extremely important, extremely desirable type of policy for an independent Scotland to follow, particularly in the first phase of its independence, as it's trying to make an image of itself in the world, right? And to say, I think that's one of the potentials. It's not a matter simply of altruism. Altruism is important in terms of Scottish tradition, is also important in terms of what it does for Scotland, what it does for Scotland's position in the world.
Robin, could I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
Just while we're here, because there's two things that confused me. I mean, this issue about the budget, the messages that around Trident I find confusing, because on the one hand we're told that as part of NATO, an independent state, that the Americans simply will not wear Scotland getting rid of nuclear weapons. In other words, the possibility of refusing to acknowledge, the new state, which is a serious issue for Scotland. On the other hand, I read of people, voices from inside the Pentagon being reported in American publications saying Britain doesn't need nuclear weapons because Britain can't afford nuclear weapons, and to be a proper friend of America, in US terms, they would prefer conventional power to be built up, because they've got the nukes if they're ever going to be needed, and we can't fire ours essentially without their say-so. And I'm confused between the two as to whether America would be, Washington would be quite sanguine about what happens to the nukes, or whether they actually want rid of them. Do we know? Is there a...
This
John,
is John's
John's
experience.
field.
Yeah, we'll come back to John. Basically, if you look at the history of this assumption that America has always been keen for Britain to have nuclear weapons, the history doesn't bear this out at all. I mean, Kennedy regarded the Polaris deal as original sin. It was the last thing he wanted to do was for his administration to support the British nuclear weapons programme. And there's a long history of that. When Wilson was elected, there was going to meet Johnson. Johnson's advisors prepared a briefing for him on the assumption that Britain wanted to disarm, and here's how we'll help you. And these are way back, but nevertheless, that trend has always been there. So if you look at it today, you've got Lockheed Martin, who are keen on, powerful players in the American establishment, and you've got other folk that are interested. I mean, it was raised at a Washington gathering recently about independence, and one of the experts there basically said it's just not on the agenda at the moment, the issue politically of Scotland independence and British nuclear weapons. And the way she put it is, some of these guys don't even know you've got nuclear weapons. In terms of the American politicians, in terms of what they are currently interested in. It's not there, and it's a wee bit uncertain as to quite how it would play out. And what again the history shows is that there is this very close nuclear relationship, but it's been heavily dependent on a few key people. In Kennedy's era, it was because of second-tier administrators who were Anglophiles and who smoothed the waters. It was certainly the same in the Trident decision in 78-82 that I've worked on, and I suspect it's the same today. There are key players who are very much want to see this thing going on, but it's a wee bit wrong to assume that that's then the case across the political system.
And I mean, let's be clear. Is the US going to cheer when Britain arrives at another conflict zone with an aircraft carrier with no crew and no planes and say, hello, here we are, and the Americans say, well, you're going to do that, and we say, don't worry though, we've got nukes in case it goes wrong. What contribution or help is that to even the US agenda? We're not going to use nukes. We are going to use conventional military. And if we invest in that heavily, we invest in nuclear heavily, we don't invest in the other side. So I am enormously sceptical from what I've read about the suggestions that the US desperately wants nuclear weapons. And if there's any doubt about that, it's the number of senior military people in the UK who have doubts about directing that volume of investment at nuclear weapons. You can't spend it twice. If we're spending it in nukes, we're not spending it on all the other things. And bluntly, for a collapsing military empire like the remnants of the UK military, it's way more... They talk all the time of prestige. Well, yeah, there's prestige and there's sheer embarrassment. So whatever nukes give them prestige, empty aircraft carriers are an embarrassment. And this idea that we can visibly see the capacity of the UK military decline and think that having nuclear weapons will compensate for that in terms of global perceptions of the UK's role is a misreading, I think, quite strongly.
One of the big advantages of the proposal of having in the Scottish Constitution a prohibition on nuclear weapons in Scottish territory is that Scotland isn't open to any kind of blackmail on this. As soon as it's in the Constitution, that's the law. And I think this is one of the attractions. And as far as it's going to be realpolitik, as far as other nations internationally, the one thing that worries me is that as soon as Scotland is independent, it's all the lobbyists and others and diplomats from all these other countries that are going to try and ensure that Scotland is friendly to their positions. And our job in Scotland, some of us who are more radical, more critical of the kind of foreign policy that the United States and others have pursued, our job, our challenge will be to ensure that Scotland plays that genuinely independent peacekeeping role and doesn't line up with what we would see some of the more reactionary elements.
And Scotland will always have most of the Northern European seaboard. Most of the access to the Northern Europe will come via Scottish waters. Nobody's going to ignore us.
Thank you.
More than welcome. Any other questions? Anyone else want to ask anything just now?
I just wanted to throw in, there's one thing that Derek was referring to, the New York Times piece.
Well, I can't remember where I read it. It's one of the American publications.
The New York Times piece from about a year and a half ago, and they specifically stated that Britain was being viewed as an unreliable partner because they'd essentially let them down military terms both in Afghanistan and Iraq. So one can assume
So conventional forces.
conventional forces is the requirement, and they should, in fact, shift their focus to that.
I think
The New York Times covers it. It's probably got some serious credibility.
I think we should bear in mind that twice in recent years, I think since 2010, senior administration officials and Robert Gates and Hillary Clinton have actually publicly opined negatively on UK defence cuts, particularly this cuts to conventional capacity. And as we all know, in terms of the diplomacy, that's almost unprecedented. Foreign governments don't comment, especially not negatively, on the economies. There's a big focus and a big concern amongst Americans. They've long been trying to push their NATO allies to actually spend more on conventional defence, and obviously this is not happening. So I would say, in terms of the nuclear weapons issue, that the key driver in the Trident's future will be this absolute, brick wall the UK government will find in actually relocating, particularly the Warhead facility. The key issue will not be the Americans pushing the MOD to try and actually sort the situation. The situation is, as some people would say, I'm sure John would agree, the situation is almost unsortable. And no amount of American pressure is going to magic a situation where a replacement for Coolport can be found.
They might outsource Trident to Serco or something as well.
A Serco
G4 will take it over, I'm sure it'll be fine.
Aldermaston, they already have
they're in Aldermaston.
Aldermaston.
Oh, do they?
Yes,
Oh, right,
yes.
there you go.
They've been there before you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right, thanks. But just while we've got a little while left, perhaps I think it might be quite useful, because another thing which we have out this morning is John's got a very helpful blog. John Ainsley's got a very helpful blog on the question of the RUSI report on relocating Trident. And I think it's quite interesting that RUSI report not only draws heavily on John's original work for Scottish CND, which I think is telling, but it draws on it so heavily that the footnotes appear to be very similar in the RUSI work and John's work, only the conclusions are difficult. John, perhaps you might want to say a few words about...
Yes, I think the background to this is that it was obvious that there's going to be this big issue of Trident independence coming up, and I did some detailed research based on some of the archive papers and looked at the feasibility of the options. Interestingly, Malcolm Chalmers is one of the authors of the latest RUSI report. His earlier studies come to very similar conclusions, again based on the archives, that the options of relocation weren't very viable. But this latest report is now taking a different line. But fundamental to that really is the idea that the nuclear weapons store, which is the difficulty is building a new nuclear weapons store, that could happen in Falmouth. Now, the latest report basically just asserts that. There's not any detailed argument as to why Falmouth is viable. And my own study was, I've looked in more detail where to put different bits of the facility, how close is it to the populated areas, and on that reason, I think it isn't a real option. Interesting, a whole series of folk have said that moving is a problem, including the Admiral Alabaster, who used to be in charge of Faslane. He basically said it was almost inconceivable. Nick Harvey, former Defence Minister, said similar things. Lord Hennessy said that a yes vote will result in nuclear disarmament for the UK. On the Falmouth option, Admiral Lord West, who is a cheerleader for Trident and very much in support of the Union. Lord West said in the 1960s the Navy was keen on using Falmouth, but it's not an option anymore. It's not an option now. So it's interesting that that's fundamental to Bruce's argument. If Falmouth isn't an option, then actually, it can't go. And I would argue that Devonport's not an option either. So really, a yes vote doesn't just result in nuclear weapons not being here, which is something that would be great anyway, but it basically creates a situation where Britain has to disarm. And the other study that we did early on is, well, how quickly can this be done? And the system can be disabled in days, the warheads can be moved out of Scotland within about 2 years, and they can be dismantled within 4 years. And those timelines were then put to several key experts, including one of the Dick Garland, who's credited as probably the true inventor of the hydrogen bomb, advisor to successive American governments. Dick Garland and a number of others basically said, look, this is a realistic timescale. One of the American experts basically said they could do it quicker. So the idea that we'll have to wait 12 years and then they're going to move to England, I think that's basically wrong and doesn't stand up.
So I think that's...
I was just going to say, and of course, given the timetable of the decision that the Westminster Parliament is going to make for the full contracts to go out on Trident renewal in 2016, nobody in their right mind, if it's a yes vote, could look at the options before them and see it was a responsible thing to proceed with Trident renewal. Because even the Rusey ultra-optimistic view that it would be over 10 years before you could build the extra facilities, assuming Falmouth was prepared to give up its lovely marina and all those expensive yachting facilities and so on that it has there. But even assuming you got agreement to go ahead with that development, you would be in a situation where you would have a non-operational nuclear system for 10 years. And what sense does that make? That would simply prove that it wasn't necessary.
Can I just, I know you want to wrap up,
sure.
But there's an issue of Dounreay that just hit the news a couple of days ago, indicating that they're having severe difficulties now with the dismantling decommissioning of Dounreay because they've left far more radioactive material in the core than they had said they had. In fact, it was characterised as a scandal. So I think it's interesting to try and link these two things together. Nuclear weapons have a risk, not just of explosion, but also of radioactive leaks. And I think that the UK's record in the commercial sector is not good. And there's growing evidence that, in fact, they've behaved rather poorly, even more so than it had been understood before in Dounreay.
Yeah, I think, in a sense, the Dounreay one is maybe a historical one that they didn't know what they're doing years ago, but there's a more recent example with the one bit of Dounreay that's still functioning. There is a military reactor at Dounreay that is functioning today, and the thing that emerged, a recent statement from Philip Hammond, who's Defence Minister, is that they discovered major problems on that prototype reactor that's still working. And the Navy's been keen on saying, we've got these new fuel cores that can last the whole life of the submarine. These things will run for 30 years. And they've basically discovered they don't. There is this thing, do they really know what they're doing? And another one was the safety of British submarines, because they used to not get the information from America. A few years ago, the Americans shared more reactor design information, and the Royal Navy suddenly realised that their own current reactors they're using would fail. They wouldn't meet American safety standards. So I think sometimes rules pulled over our eyes a wee bit that actually these people know what they're doing about nuclear safety.
Yeah, can I just wrap up comment on the economic side of the paper? I think that's a very important part as well. All the other issues are very, very coherent and make a lot of sense, but the economic supports it as well. So it is a win-win-win. Our cost, the amount that Scotland contributes to the UK defence budget, 3.3 billion annually. The white paper costed 2.5 billion, which I think is a very, very comfortable number for what we're going to be targeting as a Scottish Defence Force. But the actual fact at the moment, of course, is that something less than 2 billion of the 3.3 billion is actually spent in Scotland. So when we talk about defence jobs, Scotland's actually got a far smaller percentage of the UK total defence jobs than its population share would warrant. And there is always an opportunity, especially focused on the areas that are going to be important. In independent Scotland, marine defence, etc., when we talk about shipbuilding jobs, there is certainly the opportunity to reinvigorate that sector with investment that would follow in a Scottish marine force after independence, spending less money but focused on the right things from a defence point of view, but also on the right aspects from an economic development and job creation point of view as well.
Can I just add to that, if that's okay? This is important. It does tie into the wider, some of the wider issues. I mean, quite often, it's pretty inaccurate really, because quite often when we talk defence, people start talking about shipbuilding jobs, and I mean, it's really quite erroneous to do that. But I think it's significant to actually consider the economic implications here. I mean, the House of Lords Select Committee in the Constitution has publicly acknowledged that in the event of Scottish independence, the UK's assets, and I quote, the UK's assets and liabilities would fall to be apportioned equitably between Scotland and the remainder of the UK. And I think that the general kind of acceptance is that Scotland would be liable to inherit a population share of the MOD's defence assets. The most recent account of those assets estimates them at £92.28 billion, leaving Scotland with a notional asset inheritance of £7.75 billion. I think it's really important to actually kind of clarify this issue, because when people are talking about the finances of defence, the focus is naturally perhaps on the Scottish Government's annual £2.5 billion expenditure. But that's an annual running cost. The initial development of a defence infrastructure, of being able to build military housing, to reinvigorate bases, etc., to be able to actually develop a fleet of ships, would actually come initially from this asset apportionment from the MOD, and it's a sizable chunk of money. And again, I think that what we can actually look at more broadly is the economic and employment implications that would come from that. For example, if we're looking at a much needed rebolstering of maritime capability, things like Coast Guard vessels, fisheries protection, all these kinds of things, it's a commonly known within the shipbuilding industry that, apart from anything else, these ships would create jobs, would maintain jobs, but the building of non-military ships actually provides far higher blue-collar employment than the building of complex warships. So not only would we see a situation whereby a newly independent Scottish Government would have this sizable asset inheritance to be able to develop an infrastructure, you would see the capacity to build warships, frigates, etc., if that were deemed to be necessary by the Scottish Government. The capacity would be there to develop a far wider maritime fleet as well, and in doing so that would be a real driver to employment, which I think shouldn't be overlooked as well.
So I think what's very interesting from what we've heard this morning is that if you take a calm and proper look at what an independent Scotland could do in defence, we would start with £8 billion worth of assets which we could deploy to create a force which would actually defend Scotland's waters and its territory for the first time, could take an active role in things like smuggling and people trafficking, would enable us to play a very positive international role, because once our defence orientation was like that, we would be seen as being a positive contributor into the world stage. We can do all of that while saving at least £1 billion a year, and in the process, despite a lot of what people have said, we can create more employment, more jobs in Scotland, and we can disarm the UK, that we can disarm the UK's nuclear deterrent, and these all seem to be extremely positive contributions to the world. What's possibly a little sad is that we only ever debate the question of defence on the basis of vested interests, on the basis of a defence establishment said this and that's necessary. Let's stop, let's have a proper look at the detail of what a defence scenario for Scotland would really be like if we go through the evidence and not just rely on throwaway comments from a general here or a defence company there. And if you do that, what you see is actually Scotland's defence future and its contribution to the world defence is extremely positive, and at the same time we can save money that we can reinvest. So all the details of this is available on the paper, the Defence and Foreign Policy of an Independent Scotland, which is now available on the Commonweal website, which is allofusfirst.org. Thanks everybody. See you again tomorrow. Cheers.